Hi guys, this is Julian, and in this video I'm going to show you how I've created these animations using Cinema4d and X-Particles. Let's go! I was really inspired by this beautiful setup by Stephen Knipping from one of his Applied Houdini courses, where he created those beautiful curly velocity fields on a static object. So huge shout out to Stephen for showing this technique. And as so often, I just wanted to see if I could recreate something like that with X-Particles using Cinema. This setup is going to work with any animated object that you might have in your scene. Here in this simple demo, I've just got a regular grid displaced by a noise pattern, and I'm emitting particles from it. I then use the XP flow field to create those beautiful curly, swirly patterns. Now there's this beautiful library of animated animals from the guys at Truebones Animation Studio. If you want to follow along this tutorial, head over to Gumroad. I'll put a link in the description, and make sure to download the FBX archive that they provide. If you appreciate what they're doing, please donate a few dollars. Once you unzip the file, you'll get a folder called Truebones Zoo. And from there, you can pick any animal and simply open the folder and drag and drop it into your Cinema file. For this tutorial, I'm going to choose the brown bear. In there, I'll find the run loop.fbx. I'll bring it into Cinema R25. I hit OK, and I get the mesh and the joints. It imports at 30 frames per second, which is fine, and the timeline is 45 frames long. Now, in order to get this working with X-Particles, I found the best way to export this mesh as an alembic and then re-import that. In order to do that, I want to add a connect object, and I hit Shift-C to open up the command line, type connect, and get the connect object. Make sure to uncheck weld and put the mesh and the joints into that connect object. I'll rename it to bear, right click and say bake as alembic. I can then delete the connect object, and I'm left with just the bear as an alembic loader. Here you have the amazing opportunity to hit loop and also reduce the speed. I reduce it to 50%, extend my timeline to 300 frames, and hit play. To get the texture back, I reassign it to the bear, rename it to bear emission. Double click on the texture to open up the pop-up window, and I want to add the alpha channel. Back in the brown bear folder under text, you found the alpha channel, and also Cinema created an alembic folder inside your brown bear folder where the bear is stored. Once you've got the texture ready with the alpha channel, you can then add an XP system to your scene. I'll drag the bear alembic under utilities just for housekeeping. Head over to the emitter, go to the object tab, change the emitter shape from rectangle to object, and drag and drop the bear alembic. I don't want to emit from the polygons, I want to emit from the texture. In the texture tab, make sure to assign that material. And for the emission channel, I want to choose the alpha channel. Now if I hide the bear and hit play, you should see it working. However, I don't want any initial speed on the particles, and I don't want them to live for the whole lifespan. I want to reduce the lifespan to, let's start with 20 frames, and also add some variation to it. Let's give it 5 frames variation. To get rid of the annoying work plane, I choose Filter Presets Animation. Now I want to up the particle count. And I don't want to emit by second, which is the default, but I want to emit per frame, which automatically gives me 30 times more particles. Now we're going to change that birth rate amount quite a bit. So what I want to do is click the birth rate and drag it onto the viewport. I then right click and say show always. Now it gives me full control in the viewport over how many particles I've got. You can drag and drop that at the arrowhead, or you can just double click and change the particle count here. Now for setup and testing reasons, I'll put this to 2500 for now, and later we're going to have to up that amount quite a bit. Also under the display on the emitter section, I want to head over to HUD and show HUD, which now gives me a live count of the particles in my scene. I'd like to position it at the bottom of my screen and then move it over to the left. So now we've got around 55,000 particles. The next thing I want to do is rename that emitter to emitter A. Head over to the Group tab and create an Add a group. I'll also rename this group to Group A. Now the color gets overwritten by the texture, which is fine. However, I want to change the radius to 1, also with a variation of 1. And the other display I want to change to circle filled. Now this is going to slow down your viewport quite a bit. So for now, I'm going to change this birth rate to 500 particles per frame. Now I want to scale up and down those particles over their life. So I go to the modifier section, add a control modifier, XP scale. I want to set this to set value with a radius value of 1. And under the mapping tab, I want to add a map and change this to radius value and map it to the lifespan. Now you get particles that are 0 scale when they're born, and over the course of their lifespan, they reach 1. I want to control click on the curve to add a new point, drag this up and drag the last point down. So what I should see is particles getting born with a scale of 0, then scale up to 1, and then reduce back to 0. Now, unfortunately, I don't know how to bring back that variation that we set in the group section. This gets completely overridden by that scale modifier. If any of you guys know how to do that, please feel free to tell me in the comment section. We're going to take care of the variation of the particles in the rendering section. So now we've got particles that are being birthed on the moving object. They don't really move, and they die over around 20 frames, sorry. Now it's time to go to the Dynamics tab and choose XP Flow Field. Now the flow field is a domain that creates a vector field, and you can change that vector field under the Object tab. I don't want a random field, I want a curl field. Now by default this doesn't do anything because the field is set to direction. As soon as you change this to velocity, you should see your particles moving. In here, you can change the scale and the frequency of the curl noise pattern, and the strength and the overall strength of the whole flow field. Now this is way too fast for my liking, so I'm gonna reduce the speed to something around 25, and the acceleration I'll reduce to 15. Now I get a much smoother looking particle field. Now the cell size defines the resolution of your vector field. The lower you get, the lower you put this, the more resolution you get. I'm going to put this also to 15 and up the strength a little bit to, let's say, 35. Now, if you don't want to see the display of the curl field, you head over to the Display tab and uncheck Show Vectors. You can then hide the flow field container by Alt double-clicking on those little dots. From here, you should play around with the scale and the frequency of your noise pattern. I'm going to up the scale a little bit, which makes the vector field, the curl field, a bit smaller actually. And I'm going to up the frequency also to 160 so I get a faster moving curl pattern. For more natural effects, I tend to always use an XP Drag Modifier, which you find under the motion modifiers. You can play around with the strength multiplier. I usually leave it at around 1 to 200. Let's say to 150 for now. Now all that's left to do is rename that scale modifier to scale A and apply this only to group A. As with most effects, you should layer up your emitters to get more variation and more interesting behavior. So I'm gonna stop the timeline, head back to frame 0, hitting Shift and F, and Control click and drag the emitter to create a complete copy of it. I'm gonna rename this to emitter B, head over to the emission tab, and increase the lifespan a few frames to, let's say, 24 frames, and also up the variation to 8 frames. Now, since I've created a copy, the shortcut in the editor window also got duplicated. So I'm gonna Control click and drag it down or up respectively to have both of these settings. I'm gonna disable emitter A, also duplicate the group by Control clicking and dragging, rename this to group B, and make sure to link it in the Groups tab by deleting particle group A and adding group B to the field. I also want to duplicate the scale modifier, rename it to B, and also relink that group B that we just created. Now with this scale B modifier, I want to change the curve a little bit to have it ramp up slower, but also stay bigger a lot longer. You can then set the radius to a lower value since I want my secondary emitter to have smaller particles overall. If I then play with both emitters active, I can get a more realistic feel of what the animation is going to look like. Now that you've got the base setup working, what I want to do is, just to clean it up a bit, position the HUD display of my second emitter next to the first one. Hit play again and take a look at what we've got so far. Now it's time to up the particle count, but like I said before, with the editor display set to circles, this is going to slow down your viewport drastically. So I'm going to change that to squares. Go back to frame 0 and up the particle count of my first emitter to, let's say, 12,000 particles per frame, and emitter B to even more, let's say 15,000 for now. Now this is not going to play back in real time, but you should see a lot more how your animation is going to look like. Now what you can do from here is either create a viewport render sequence of your current animation, or if you feel like it, you could already cache this out and play it back in your viewport. Now what I can see right away is that the flow field effect is has the same strength over the whole bear. And in this particular case, I want to limit it a bit more to the body and not so much on the head. And that's with all the objects in cinema. You can use fields to define where your effect's going to take place. So for now, I'm going to unhide the bear. Go back to the flow field, unhide the flow field. Head over to the Fields tab and create a linear field. I'm going to make it a bit smaller and move it more towards where the head is. I'm going to hit the middle mouse button to jump to the quad view. Zoom out a bit and position it roughly around the neck area. Now I never know whether it's X plus or X minus. In this case, it seems to be X minus does the job. Now if I hide the bear again, I should get less of the flow field effect around the head area. What you could do also is duplicate the flow field object and limit it to group B and give it a different size curl pattern. For now, I'm going to leave it like that. What I want to do in both emitters is go to Emission, Motion Inheritance, and check Use Motion Inheritance. Now this is going to use the velocity of your moving object. I don't want 100% strength, I just want it a little bit, so I put this to 10. And now I think it's time for a quick flipbook play blast of the animation so far. So I'm going to hit Ctrl B to go to my render settings. Change it from standard to viewport renderer, uncheck save. Give it a frame range by either choosing all frames or just type in your frame range here. So I want 150 frames of the viewport, and under the filter tab, I want to say geometry only so I don't get all the other HUD elements. I'm going to hit Shift and R to render that, and I'll be back as soon as this is done. Now here we are, back with the first flipbook. I can see right off the bat that it seems like the particles are living too long. However, we can control that a bit more once we render, since the particles are going to scale down, which is not displayed currently. Now for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to add one more thing to the scene, which is a ground plane that has an XP collision tag on it. So I'm going to close the picture viewer, create a plane object, unhide the bear so I can check if it actually sits on the ground, which it seems to do pretty nicely. You could move down the plane just a little bit by going to coordinates and just bring it down ever so slightly. Bring it also under the Utilities menu for housekeeping. Rename it to Collider, hide it, and again hit Shift and C, type in Collider, and you get the XP Collider tag. I'm going to leave everything as default. Hide the bear again, and I feel confident enough to now cache out the scene. And in order to create a cache object, you go to the Utilities section and choose the XP Cache object. Now this is going to default to a path that I definitely want to change, so I'm going to hit the 3 dots on the side and head over to my dedicated cache folder. Hit OK. I want to compress the cache on build, everything's fine. So I'm just going to hit build cache, and I'll be back once that has finished. All right, the cache has finished building. It took around 6 minutes on my laptop, which isn't too bad. Now I can scrub the timeline and see what's going on here. Now, let me just create a camera, change the focal length to something a bit nicer, look through it, and roughly position it to the side so we get the main perspective working. if you right click on those little arrows, you can zero out those parameters. And I think I'm pretty happy with the results so far. Of course, it's going to look totally different once we render it. But for now, I want to conclude this first part and rather record a second video for the rendering part. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Feel free to share your thoughts and comments. And I'll see you in part 2 when we take this simulation into Octane Render and make it look really great. Thanks.